Hey guys, tonight we journey into one of the coldest nightmares of human history. Why medieval winters were downright brutal. Imagine waking up to dawn so frigid that your breath turns into tiny clouds the moment it leaves your lungs, and your wool tunic feels like wet cardboard wrapped around an icicle. You probably won't survive this, just kidding sort of. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You open your eyes on a half-rotted straw mattress that's frozen stiff bits of straw, poking your cheek like miniature porcupines. A faint orange glow from the hearth, your only source of heat, flickers in the corner of the dark hall. Mainstream historians note that medieval winters in Europe could stretch from November through March without mercy thanks to the onset of the Little Ice Age around the 14th century. Historians still argue whether the Little Ice Age began as early as the 13th century or peaked later, but everyone agrees it was bone-chillingly cold. Your first poke at the thin wool blanket confirms your worst suspicion. It's damp with condensation from last night's breath, meeting the freezing air. Fringe folklore claims that people sometimes tucked warm stones heated by the dying embers under their blankets, but you wouldn't want to wake up with a rock burn on your backside. There's a reason medieval spice merchants never sold comfy bedtime stones. Whether that actually helped or just gave you third-degree burns remains a matter of debate among scholars. As you pull yourself upright, your feet hit the cold wooden planks, sending a zap of pain up your legs. You stumble toward the fire, leaving footprints in a thin layer of frost that has crept in from the open door. The whole single window is glazed with ice, offering a glimpse of the gray dawn outside. Through the frost, you spy skeletal trees and the courtyard blanketed in powdery snow. The entire world beyond these walls looks like someone hit a freeze frame on a broken snow globe. Your stomach grumbles, another medieval horror story in the making. Sleep does little to dull the ache of an empty gut, especially when grain stores often freeze solid, turning precious wheat into unusable ice blocks. A mainstream fact, many villages stored their grain in raised thatch-roofed granaries to keep rodents at bay, but they never anticipated mice forming their tiny frozen castles. Some villagers reportedly fought rats by heating iron bars and standing guard at the granary door. Frankenstein-style winter warfare, if you ask me. You wrap your patch cloak around yourself, though wrap is generous. It's more like wearing a damp rag and shuffle to the hearth. A few embers cling desperately to life, hissing as you blow on them. A quirk of medieval life. Some people kept animal bladders inflated over their fireplaces to slow heat loss, creating a bladder barrier. You have to wonder if medieval interior designers touted that as cutting-edge home decor. Historians still argue whether bladder barrier insulation ever provided more warmth or simply terrified houseguests. You lean in closer, warming your frozen fingers and trying not to inhale too much soot. Smoke from the fire swirls in thick ribbons around the low ceiling, making your eyes water. Cramped halls like this one were notorious for being smoke-choked. Without chimneys, everyone shared the same smoky air. One medieval architect famously designed a crude flue, but critics said it looked more like a giant wizard's hat than a ventilation system. A stray thought crosses your mind: how did anyone choreograph a three-course feast in this blizzard of misery? Yet banquets did persist. If you were lucky enough to be a noble who could afford to import spices you might taste peppered venison, while peasants scraped frozen barley porridge off their bowls. Fringe recipes even called for broth made from boiled cow hooves to extract every scrap of gelatinous warmth. Culinary scholars still debate whether those hoof broths actually tasted like winter or just tasted like hoof. Your laugh comes out as a little puff of smoke. 3 jokes already and we're barely past dawn impressive. You might consider charging admission for this exclusive winter wake-up call. Then again, with no heaters or hot cocoa, who'd sign up? Remember, cocoa didn't arrive in Europe until centuries later. Your ancestors missed that shipment. As you settle on a nearby wooden bench, you feel the chill seeping through your bones. Every exhale feels like a tiny frostbite experiment on your face. A mainstream fact: lords often kept hair fur rugs by their beds to stave off the worst of the cold, but these were rare luxuries. The common folk improvised by layering scraps of cloth and moss between blankets. Whether that was enough to make a difference is debated by modern researchers, but at least it gave you something soft to sneeze into. Outside, the wind howls, like a wounded wolf rattling the heavy door. You stand bracing yourself against the second wave of cold air that rushes in, when a fellow villager stumbles inside, cursing the day they were born. He's wearing a leather jerkin that looks like it was dipped in the sea, probably soaked through with melted snow. You exchange sympathetic nods, solidarity among the frostbitten. The day hasn't even begun yet. You've already survived the medieval morning's icebox awakening. You rub your arms, reminding yourself that the worst is yet to come. But for now, you cling to the meager warmth of these embers and wonder how human beings manage to endure months of this relentless freeze. You step outside into a tunnel of crystalline white, where every breath you draw feels like swallowing shards of glass. The world around you has transformed into a frozen labyrinth. Rooftops sag under heavy snow trees, stand like frosted sentinels, and roads, once your lifeline to neighboring villages, lie buried beneath, drifts up to your waist. Medieval Europe's winters weren't just cold, they reshaped the very geography you thought you knew. Mainstream records tell us that in some years, like the infamous Great Frost of 1360, rivers such as the Thames froze solid for weeks, allowing street vendors to wheel carts directly onto the ice. Historians still argue whether those frost fairs were joyous market days or desperate survival gatherings. You trudge forward, each footstep a small victory against the sucking snow. Travel lanes you once used for carting grain now resemble white canyons, forcing travelers into single-file pilgrimages. Fringe accounts whisper of villagers carving makeshift tunnels through drifts, hand-hewn snow passages that doubled as communal shortcuts. Some claim these tunnels were so extensive that people forgot the surface paths entirely, leading to snow maze confusion. Scholars debate whether these subterranean roads were widespread innovations or merely winter myths born from cabin fever. As the gray sky hovers low, you realize just how disorienting this endless whiteness can be. Landmarks vanish, church steeples, once your guiding stars, now appear as low ridges of ice. You remember the crocodile dung sunscreen from last month's heatwave story. Here, no amount of foul-smelling paste could keep your skin from cracking. Thank heavens medieval aristocrats didn't try smearing snow on their faces to stay cool. Now that would be ironic. The snow muffles every sound. No birdsong, no village chatter, only the crunch of your boots and the distant cry of a stray dog searching for scraps. Geomancers of the era claimed the winter cold was a cosmic punishment, blaming shifting stars for sneaking in gusts stronger than a dragon's breath. Meanwhile, mainstream geographers wrote that volcanic eruptions in Iceland had spewed enough ash into the upper atmosphere to dim the sun plunging Europe into cooling darkness. Historians still argue whether those eruptions triggered the Little Ice Age or merely intensified existing trends. You reach a frozen riverbank. What was once a flowing artery of commerce is now as solid as carved marble. You balance atop the ice and peer down. Below, dark water still trickles, trapped in a narrow vein beneath inches of frost. Villagers reportedly skated across these frozen waterways, using sharpened poles to push themselves along. Fringe lore even suggests children played hockey with animal skulls, though scholars dismiss that as a prankster's exaggeration. Traipsing across the ice feels like a treacherous tightrope act. One misstep, and you could plunge into frigid water and then be swept under the ice pack like a trapped fish. Some medieval guides carried slender poles to prod the ice ahead, testing its thickness, a technique that occasionally backfired when breaking through into thigh-deep slush. Whether this pole probing saved lives or just created more wet socks is still a topic of heated debate among archaeological teams. Beyond the river's fields lie entombed under snowdrifts so vast that villages look like islands in a wide sea. You scan the horizon and spot the silhouette of a lone farmhouse perched atop a hill. It reminds you of that bladder barrier insulation idea. Except here, the snow itself acted as a giant thermal blanket. Locals sometimes built snow walls around their huts to block biting winds and trap residual heat. Fringe builders claimed that thicker snow walls felt like curling up inside a polar bear's fur, though skeptics question if anyone enjoyed that level of cuddling. Because winter cut villages off from one another, rumors and gossip spread more slowly than usual. You pause to consider how that must have felt isolated in a white void, with only flickering hearts and hushed voices for company. You'd probably pay someone in bark bread just for a traveling bard's tales of sunshine. You might have to wait until summer for that, of course. Unless someone invented a mobile sun lamp out of goat fat and amber. For miles, you see no living creature, except the occasional raven perched dark as coal against the snow. Some superstitious souls thought these birds were harbingers of doom sent by frost spirits to spy on humanity. Yet, mainstream naturalists simply noted that ravens adapted well to cold climates, scavenging carcasses left by frostbitten sheep. Historians still debate whether ravens were revered as supernatural messengers or just annoying scavengers, stealing your dinner. Every hill you climb exhausts you further. Your tunic and cloak, already damp from melting snowflakes, now freeze solid on your back. You recall that hoof broth joke from the hall, if only you'd packed a flask of hot liquid to thaw out with. Jokes about medieval hot toddies wouldn't ride for centuries, but the concept would surely have been a game changer here. Eventually, you crest a ridge and gaze down upon the village ahead. Smoke spirals lazily from chimney holes. Your first beacon of warmth in this frozen wilderness. The frozen geography has tested your resolve, but it has also taught you resilience, adapting by forging new tunnels, trusting makeshift ice bridges, and turning snow into both barrier and blanket. Still, you know this is just the beginning of a season that will stretch your endurance to its limits. As you descend, the snow crunch beneath your boots grows louder, reminding you that even in the silence of winter, your presence echoes. Ahead lies Shelterheart and a chance to defy this frozen expanse, if only for a moment. You brace yourself for what comes next, knowing the landscape's frozen grip is unrelenting, and historians will argue for centuries about whether geography or climate was the true foe. You shuffle into the village's communal granary, steeling yourself for another day of culinary disappointment. Behind you, the wind rattles shutters like skeletal fingers tapping on wood, and you can almost taste the frost in the air. Here, food is more rumor than reality. You pry open the heavy doors to reveal rows of wooden bins that once brimmed with wheat and barley. Now, many compartments hold nothing more than clumps of ice-crusted grain, spoiled by damp and perhaps by mice, that turned your provisions into their private winter larder. Mainstream record keepers note that medieval communities typically aimed to store at least 3 months of grain to survive winter, but they rarely anticipated rot setting in. When moisture seeped through thatch roofs, historians still argue whether raised stone foundations or more elaborate thatching techniques would have prevented granary dampness. But most villagers weren't masters of carpentry. You peer closely at a barrel labeled oats, only to recoil when a musky odor erupts, reminding you of a damp dog bed. Fringe tales claim that some desperate souls tried burying grain in snow tunnels, believing the sub-zero temperatures would preserve it like a natural freezer. Yet, scholarly debate questions whether those snow-packed caches stayed dry or just turned everything into an icy mush that required hours of thawing over sputtering embers. Your stomach rumbles as if protesting this entire exercise. You clutch your midsection, likely the only thing still flexible after weeks of cold, and tiptoe across icy floorboards toward a small cooking hearth. A few embers glow, but they sigh and fade before you can light a pot. You're left to contemplate the sad stench of rancid cheese. A villager left on the bench hoping for a quick nibble. The cheese's mold blooms in intricate patterns, pretty enough to rival a stained glass window but far less appetizing. You consider scraping away the green fuzz and calling it artisanal, but you decide against it. A mainstream inside monasteries often maintain more robust food stocks, including salted fish and dried legumes, to sustain monks through lean seasons. You've heard that some monasteries offered relief to starving peasants, handing out soup made from boiled turnips and onion peels, which, let's be honest, tastes like someone boiled old boot leather. Historians still argue whether such charity was widespread or mostly symbolic, performed more for the church's reputation than for real aid. You remember a fringe anecdote about an itinerant friar who supposedly made a miracle stew by collecting moss from church walls and brewing it in water, claiming it had medicinal properties. Scholars ever the party poopers debate whether moss stew provided any nutrients or simply gave the illusion of fullness through sheer psychological willpower. You rummage through a wooden cupboard and pull out the only edible thing within reach: bark bread. Yes, you're chewing on a tree. In theory, bark bread involves mixing inner tree bark with grain flour to stretch supplies. In practice, it tastes like chewing on a pencil eraser. A fringe baker once attempted adding honey and wild berries to mask the flavor, but locals say it only attracted bears. Scholars still argue whether bark bread was a rare emergency ration or a mass-market staple all winter long. You pick at the edges of a small ration of salted pork, the only meat the village could spare. Salt not only preserved the meat, but also turned it into a gritty, almost chalk-like substance. Most of the salt had dissolved in melting snow water, leaving you with something more akin to flavored pumice stone. You swallow a bite grimace and pray silently that medieval taste testers never wrote Yelp reviews. Your mind drifts to the notion of famine and its true terror. Mainstream sources record that famines in the 14th century could kill up to a third of a population when bad harvests coincided with harsh winters. Historians still argue whether the Black Death or successive famines did more damage to medieval society, but there's no doubt that starvation was a fearsome specter, looming over every hearth. In a dusty corner, you notice a tuft of dried seaweed in a clay jar. Fringe Folklore insisted that strips of kelp boiled in water provided essential minerals and prevented scurvy so long as you didn't mind the taste of the ocean's rotting tide. Scholars debate whether inland communities ever had access to seaweed or if such stories were maritime legends blown inland by traveling sailors. Your hands tremble slightly as you refill your wooden bowl with thin porridge, more water than grain, a concoction so watery it could be classified as medieval witch's brew. You stir with a twig, watching the pale gruel swirl like misty pond water. 3 light jokes. You realize this could double as early morning wallpaper. You consider submitting it to the village's funniest liquid contest, and you wonder if adding hoof broth might give it a fighting chance. Yet ironically, that hoof broth you crave sits in your memory as a relic of a promised comfort you haven't tasted in weeks. You carry the steaming bowl out into the courtyard where a cluster of villagers stand in a frozen circle, each holding their meager portions. A child lifts a spoon to her lips and then sighs as the porridge cools instantly into crisp air. You catch her eye and she gives you a sympathetic grin, one shared by everyone who knows. The relief of a warm heart is another day's distant dream. You return to the hall, sliding the icy door shut behind you with a thud that reverberates through your bones. The porridge sits unused on the bench, now too cold to eat, too valuable to waste. You glance around at your neighbors' faces, pale eyes, hollow, and coats crusted with snow. Even the hearth's embers look reluctant to offer comfort. As you settle back on your straw mattress, remnants of frost cling to your cloak. You wrap the overstuffed bowl in cloth, hoping to preserve a modicum of warmth. For later, though you suspect it will freeze solid by bedtime. You breathe deeply, inhaling the earthy scent of grain mold and something that might be hope. You wonder how much longer you can cling to this thread of sustenance before the darkness of famine closes in completely. Despite the bleakness, you recognize the human spirit's stubborn refusal to surrender. You share silent solidarity with every frostbitten soul here, bound by shared hunger and the faintest spark of resilience. Tomorrow you'll return to this granary, maybe discover another barrel of salvageable grain, and maybe witness yet another miracle of survival. For now, though, you sip at your meager porridge, feeling its thin warmth against your lips, and you marvel at how medieval people survived months of near starvation with nothing but courage, creativity, and what historians still debate as proto-food science. You tug at your threadbare wool cloak, marveling at how a single draft can turn your chest into an icicle. The coarse fibers, once thick and warm, have thinned over repeated washings and patch jobs, each meant a testament to survival, but also a parade of holes, letting cold straight to your skin. You probably won't survive this frost festival of fabric failure. But hey, who said medieval fashion was practical? Historians still argue whether peasants ever truly layered up like their noble counterparts or simply accepted the chill as fate. Mainstream dress records tell us that most common folk owned only 2 sets of clothing, one good set for Sundays and festivals, and one working set for every other day. Your linen shirt underneath is stiff from dampness and wear its collar fraying like a broom's whiskers. Fringe lore claims that some inventive villagers stuffed their shirts with dried moss, ostensibly to mimic fur lining, but you're left sneezing more than you're warmed. Scholars debate whether moss insulation was anything more than a desperate gimmick or a genuine proto-winter parka. As you angle yourself toward the small hearth, the heat briefly warms your fingertips until you remember your gloves are little more than leather scraps tied together with twine. Those leather palm guards, once thought to be a stroke of genius, now chafe your skin and leak cold like a sieve. You half expect to find a sign taped to your wrist reading glove sale, one size fits none. Yet, in some villages, wealthy merchants supposedly imported fur mittens from Russia, luxuries so coveted that locals swapped church pew donations for a few strands of sable. Historians still argue whether these furs made it far inland or were hoarded in coastal trading towns. Your breeches a mismatched duo of faded wool and patched linen cling damply to your legs. Every step forward is a battle against the wind, trying to peel them off like a stubborn cast. In theory, layering clothwork, a wool layer over linen traps, warm air close to the body. In practice, your straps more moisture, turning each movement into a condensation experiment. French tailors once suggested sewing straw between layers for extra loft. Imagine wearing a walking scarecrow suit, but you'd rather face the cold than risk looking like a garden decoration. Scholars debate whether straw quilting ever truly gained traction or was dismissed as Heibergine couture. The hood you pull up over your head is no match for the biting breeze, sneaking through loose stitches. It rattles like a hollow drum when you shake your head and snowflakes drift through the gaps, tickling your scalp. You think back to that crocodile dung sunscreen anecdote this time. You wish someone had invented crocodile dung balaclavas. 3 light jokes you imagine medieval meme makers captioning this hood, DIY ice bucket, head challenge you consider selling earmuffs, carved from wood, and you ponder if your hood doubles as a novelty snow globe. Your stockings once woven by your mother's nimble fingers now sport frayed edges and oversized elbows at the knees holes, so large that frostbite could slip right in. Word on the street is that some folks wore 2 stockings per leg, turning walk to waddle. But at least you stayed warmerish. Historians still debate whether double-layered hose significantly reduced heat loss or simply made medieval legs look like sausage casings. Peering down, you notice your shoes cracked leather with soles so thin they might as well be paper. Each step delivers a shock straight into your spine, a cold sympathizer reminding you how foolish you were to think boots were optional. Fringe cobblers supposedly experimented with wrapping animal pelts around feet and securing them with rawhide thongs. Proto-moccasins, if you will, but skeletal remains rarely show these creatures at burial sites, bringing into question their prevalence. Scholars argue whether these pelts decayed in the soil or were more myth than method. You lift one foot examining a tiny hole near the toe where snow has crept in. Your sock inside is damp and clings uncomfortably, a soggy reminder that cotton-like fabrics weren't available until long after. You curse the absence of wool-blend multi-fiber technology. You might joke that you've invented the world's first water filter sock, but the truth is, toes are turning icicle blue as you stand there. Historians know that some peasants wrapped cloth around their feet and then dipped them in hot tallow, a practice producing a greasy barrier, but you fear you'd smell like a frying fish more than feel warmer. Scholars still argue whether tallow treatments provided real insulation or just left people slick and stinky. Your sleeves are another tale of medieval ingenuity. Gone awry extra fabric, sewn onto the cuffs to catch more warmth, now dangling like empty pockets, catching nothing but wind. You yank the ends across your face, inadvertently muffling your voice into a low mumble. A few villagers believe that smearing lard on cuffs would seal in heat, skin-friendly or not, but you wonder if they tested this on themselves or sacrificed a few volunteer peasants first. Fringe chemists supposedly mixed lard with crushed berries to create fragrant insulation, but then your fashion sense might have followed a distinctly fruity scent trail. You glance around the hall, noticing that everyone else's clothing seems to be auditioning for the same featureless role. Hobo chic meets frostbitten. Even the local blacksmith whose forge stays lit most of the day, shows up in scorch-kissed cloaks that look like they've been patched more times than a pirate's sail. Historians still argue whether blacksmith's wool was woven in thicker batches for their benefit, or if they simply hoarded scraps to survive. Desperate to salvage warmth, you retreat closer to the hearth. A traveling merchant once offered you a genuine beaver fur hat for the price of 3 barley loaves. You balked at the time, but now you trade your entire linen shirt, plus the one good tunic you've got left for a snug beaver cap. You joke that this is the moment you'd invent an IPO for fur stock trading. In truth, beaver pelts were highly prized, fueling not just warmth but the fur trade that historians argue reshaped economies. As you settle on the bench with the other cold souls, you press your legs together like turtles in hibernation, trying to conserve any trace of heat. The hearth's glow feels insufficient, barely coaxing warmth into your fingers before surrendering to the draft. Yet the human spirit persists. Someone cracks a joke about fashion-forward frost lines, and the smallest smile appears on a face chipped by windburn. You realize that while fabric may fail, solidarity weaves a cloak of its own. You close your eyes briefly, imagining the day when wool spinning tools will enable thicker yarns, or when cotton imports will make linen feel luxurious. Until then, you'll continue to shuffle through this frost-fractured world, mending your cloak with whatever materials you can scrounge, and telling yourself that one day future generations will wear heated garments and wonder how their great-great ancestors braved such chilly couture. You ease back into the hall where the low ceiling presses down like an icy lid, forcing you to hunch over as if perpetually bowing to winter's tyranny. Smoke from the central hearth swirls in heavy clouds, settling on rough-hewn beams overhead and stinging your eyes. Crowded stone halls were the norm in medieval villages. Monks' dormitories sometimes housed dozens together, and even peasant longhouses could accommodate entire families under one roof. Historians still argue whether spreading out into smaller rooms might have been healthier or simply impractical given timber shortages. The air is thick with a dozen mingled odors: damp, straw, charred wood, sweaty bodies, and the faint tang of last night's pine sap incense burned in a bid to purify the space. Fringe chroniclers claim that some villages dispersed juniper branches beneath sleeping mats, believing the scent would ward off frost spirits. Scholars debate whether juniper bundles did anything more than mask smells, or if they truly lifted morale enough to make the cold feel slightly less oppressive. You settle onto a wooden bench that doubles as a bed, wiping a sheen of soot from its hard surface. The bench sits alongside others in tight rows, each no more than a few inches apart. In most peasant longhouses, benches and platforms line the walls, leaving a narrow central walkway. There was no notion of personal space. Mainstream accounts note that families often slept head to toe. To share warmth, a practice still debated for its true efficacy in heat retention, versus the risk of spreading disease. Across from you, your neighbor, a wiry farmer named Elric, coughs into his sleeve, sending a puff of mist into the lamplit gloom. Diseases spread rapidly in such cramped quarters, especially respiratory infections. Historians still argue whether overcrowding or insufficient ventilation was the larger culprit in medieval mortality rates. Either way, the close quarters make you acutely aware of every creak in the floorboards and every rasp in your neighbor's throat. You glance up at the hearth's meager flames. Smoke funnels upward through a small hole in the roof, a primitive smoke hole that does little to clear the thick haze. Without proper chimneys until later centuries, indoor fires created constant smog. Fringe architectural notes argue that some enterprising villagers repurposed old animal horns as makeshift flues, believing the curve would better channel smoke skyward. Scholars debate whether any survived long enough to assess their performance or simply vanished with the horn's owner. As you tuck your cloak tighter around your shoulders, you notice condensation dripping from the ceiling beams, bright droplets that splatter onto your blanket like tiny cold bombs. Moisture in the air freezes upon contact with those beams only to thaw when the fire crackles below, creating a ceaseless drip-drip rhythm. You joke that this hall doubles as a medieval water feature ambient cave experience included. Yet no one chuckles. Everyone's too busy bracing for the next icicle to drop on their head. A small window glazed with oiled parchment rather than glass lets in the faintest sliver of pale daylight. The membrane wavers in the chill, letting gusts of air whip inside. You remember hearing that only the wealthiest nobles installed small glass panes imported from Venice, huge luxuries rumored to cost more than a year's rent. Historians still argue how widespread glass windows were outside of city manors. But here, we're lucky if the wind doesn't howl directly through the cracks. You shift position legs tucked beneath you and attempt to warm your back. The stone walls radiate no heat. If anything, they seem to draw warmth away. Mainstream builders began adding wooden paneling later on to reduce this thermal sink effect. But in your era, rough masonry ruled. French builders once claimed lining walls with animal skins would create a living insulation, though the stink of cured hide may have outweighed any warmth gained. Scholars still debate whether hide lining was ever practical or simply localized to frontier settlements. Your stomach growls again, echoing eerily in the smoky chamber. 3 light jokes you consider starting a medieval crowdfunding campaign for a larger hearth. Imagine selling shares in a future chimney startup and dream of a world where homes come with built-in radiators. Yet, reality bites harder. The central hearth provides warmth only to the few nearest it. Beyond a 10-foot radius, frost stakes its claim. A child in the corner nestles close to her mother, sharing body heat in a desperate bid for comfort. Historians note that infant mortality spiked in winter months, and scholars still argue whether this was due to the cold itself or the infectious diseases rampant in closed spaces. You wonder how that mother can sleep amid chimney smoke and freezing drafts, and yet she does artfully balancing tenderness and endurance. You lean forward, propping your elbows on your knees, and exhale a slow sigh. You spot an old clay pot hanging above the hearth, blackened by soot and cracked around its belly. It contains a lukewarm broth of turnip, onion peel, and salt, tomorrow's meager breakfast, chilling as it swings. Fringe gossip claims that adding a pinch of powdered unicorn horn or powdered bone, to be honest, could revive flavor, though scholars scoff at such alchemical claims. Still, if you had the unicorn powder, you'd mix it in for a shot of hope. As the day lengthens, more villagers file in. From their frozen chores, firewood scavenged from frost-snapped forests, water hauled from the half-iced well firewood, trimmed to ember size. They trudge through the hall trailing snow and steam, crowding the central area until every inch of floor space is claimed. No seating remains, so some lean against the walls, shifting from foot to avoid numbness. You rise, stiff and reluctant, and decide to fetch fresh embers from the hearth. Kneeling, you cup the dying flames with a bristle of straw to coax them back to life. The small roar of red and orange flicker is a bomb, momentarily chasing the chill from your fingertips. You carry the embers to the center of the hall, hoping the spread-light sparks will heat the gathering throng, even as some villagers complain that they're still too cold to appreciate the gesture. You return to your bench, feeling the floorboards beneath you pulse with residual warmth. For a fleeting moment, you imagine this hall as a snug chalet, Walls lined with tapestries and floors cushioned with rugs. Then reality snaps back, no tapestries here. Only rough walls covered in faded cloth patches that do little more than catch drips. Historians debate whether wealthier parishes ever sold off old tapestries to fund winter relief, but your village's coffers are emptier than your stomach. Despite all this, a subtle camaraderie fills the space. A hushed chatter rises as neighbors share news of who found saplings with usable branches, who spotted a thawed stream for fresh water, and who scrounged extra straw for bedding. You realize that cramped and cold though you are, the hall holds a warmth born of solidarity. Among smoke and frost, the human spirit finds a spark that refuses to extinguish. You press your palms together, feeling the slight heat left in your fingers, and close your eyes. The smog, the draft, the dripping ceiling, they're all part of this frozen tapestry you inhabit. And as you settle back into the close embrace of your communal shelter, you whisper a quiet vow. Come what may, you'll endure this frigid crucible alongside these fellow survivors, warmed by the community when the heart cannot warm you fully. You strap on your worn leather satchel and step back into the biting wind, preparing to traverse the treacherous pathways that link this village to the next. Every journey in winter feels like venturing through a white tomb. One misstep could seal your fate forever. Mainstream travel logs reveal that medieval couriers moved no more than 10 miles per day in heavy snow, often taking twice as long as in fair weather. Historians still argue whether establishing more frequent relay stations would have significantly improved communication or simply drained scarce resources. Your first obstacle is the frozen river crossing. The ice here is thick, sometimes over a foot deep, but still prone to dangerous cracks. You test each step with the slender wooden pole you carry, listening for hollow sounds. Before advancing, fringe adventurers claim to have built small sleds pulled by goats to distribute weight, but scholars debate whether goats would cooperate or simply bolt at the first crack. On one occasion, a traveling monk supposedly tethered himself to a line of villagers, tripping them all into icy water. Some say it was a cautionary tale, while others insist it happened. Once across, you find yourself on a narrow forest trail, where snowdrifts tower above your head. Trees stripped bare of leaves resemble skeletal hands clutching at the gray sky. You shuffle forward one foot, carefully placed before the other, your breath steaming in rhythmic puffs. A fringed tale recounts a hunter who navigated by tying colored ribbons to branches until the wind blew them all away, leaving him hopelessly lost. Modern scholars still debate whether such rudimentary trail markers were ever truly effective or simply added to winter misery. The silence is profound. No birdsong chirps through the branches. Even the forest creatures have burrowed deep into their dens. Mainstream naturalists note that many animals hibernated or migrated to avoid the atrophy of cold, leaving the woods hauntingly empty. Historians still argue whether the disappearance of common wildlife significantly impacted medieval diets or merely served as background scenery for winter's hush. You pause at a small clearing where a lone hutch stands, once housing a village pig now abandoned and hollow. The scant traces of straw inside hint at hasty evacuation. Pigs were often slaughtered before winter's peak to conserve scarce fodder. Fringe sources claim some pig carcasses were preserved by packing them in salt and snow, creating a curious ice bacon prized by the wealthy. Scholars, however, question whether any of that salted, snow-cured pork ever tasted better than glacial ham. Continuing uphill, you discover the remnants of a snow bridge. Two felled trunks covered in a thick layer of snow spanning a narrow ravine. You carefully inch across, gripping the bark as if it were a lifeline. One false slip, and you tumble into the gully, scraping frozen bone on jagged rocks. Mainstream engineering texts from the era recommend building simple wooden walkways over dangerous terrain, but timber was expensive and often reserved for siege works, not village maintenance. Historians still argue whether villagers could have pooled resources to build more permanent crossings or simply lacked the incentive. As you climb higher, the wind intensifies, whipping snow into your face and forcing you to squint through the biting flurry. You pull your hood low and press your shoulder into the gusts, hunkering down against nature's assault. Fringe folklore holds that mountain winds were the breaths of ancient giants turned to stone, exhaling their final fury at mortal trespassers. Scholars scoff or ponder whether such myth helped villagers conceptualize the invisible forces that buffeted them. You reach a ridge that grants a brief panorama of the frozen valley below. Villages dot the landscape like frosted jewels, each ringed by fields of white. In the distance, the silhouette of a knight's castle looms, a beacon of relative comfort with its thick walls and heated chambers. Yet even those fireplaces struggled to warm sprawling halls. Mainstream architectural studies reveal that castles often lost more heat through large windows than they produced, leading occupants to rely on tapestries hung across doorways. Historians still argue whether some castles were better designed for warmth or simply built for spectacle. Your journey dips into another patch of woods where the snow turns soft and silent underfoot. Suddenly, a sled drawn by a laborious horse emerges from the haze, carrying a load of firewood. The animal's puffs of steam rise like ghostly apparitions, and you can't help but joke. "Nice ride, pal, too bad you can't hitch a goat." 3 light quips later, you clamber onto the back to help balance the load, surprising both yourself and the driver. The horse snorts in gratitude or protest and continues onward, leaving tracks that guide you. You follow the sled's path to a way station, a small outbuilding with walls lined in straw, and a single smoky brazier. Here, villagers rest, briefly trading quick news. Who found moss for insulation, who heard rumors of a thaw next week. Mainstream chronicles state that royal messengers sometimes use such way stations to relay news, change horses, and dry out the parchment. Historians still argue whether this network was reliable during severe winters or collapsed under its weight. Inside, you warm your hands over the brazier, noting how it crackles against the cold. The heat here is fleeting. You know that step outside seals your fate for the next hour. Fringe accounts speak of farmers who built miniature greenhouses frames draped with oiled cloth to sprout early vegetables, but skeptics doubt any crops could survive in such conditions. Scholars debate whether these proto-hothouses ever yielded enough produce to matter or were vanity projects for the curious. After a brief respite, you hoist your satchel and continue. The final leg involves crossing a frozen marsh, a quagmire, hidden beneath deceptive snow. You place your pole ahead, digging through the surface until you feel firm ground. The marsh coughs up a cold mist as you advance, reminding you of earlier frost fair fairs, when revelers skated atop frozen rivers, unaware of weak spots beneath. Historians still argue whether those fairs were celebrations of community spirit or reckless gambles with death. At last, you step onto solid ground and see the dim glow of the next village's hearth through a grove of frosted pines. Relief floods you and you dare a light joke. Finally, no more goat sleds or frozen pig huts. You trudge forward, grateful that the hazards of medieval winter travel are behind you, at least until tomorrow's errands. Yet you also carry with you a deeper respect for those who braved such journeys, daily binding communities across icebound landscapes. and proving that even the harshest cold couldn't sever the threads of medieval life. You entered the smoky little infirmary, annexed to the manor house, its low-ceilinged chamber filled with the bitter scent of burning herbs and the distant groans of the ailing. Frost-patterned windows cast mottled shadows on rough-hewn benches, where villagers huddle beneath threadbare blankets. You can almost hear your heartbeat each thump, reminding you that in medieval winters, disease spread as fast as rumor. Mainstream chronicles record that cold, damp conditions fueled outbreaks of pneumonia and typhus, claiming hundreds in even small villages. Historians still argue whether overcrowding or nutritional deficiencies played a greater role in these winter mortality spikes. A feeble fire smolders in the hearth, its warmth barely touching the far corners of the room. You sidle past a wooden rack hung with dried yarrow mugwort and elderflower's medicinal plants, prized for their supposed healing properties. Fringe herbalists once insisted that triple steeping yarrow with goat's milk warded off frostbite-induced fevers, though scholars question whether ingesting cold dairy in winter did more harm than good. You scrape a small tuft of yarrow into a clay bowl, imagining its tangy bitterness coating your tongue. The patient nearest you is old Jutta, her face pale as a snowdrift, and her breathing raspy like wind through a hollow log. And mainstream observation mortality rates for the aged soared in cold months, thanks partly to weakened immune systems and cramped living conditions. You recall hearing that some monastic infirmaries allowed elderly peasants to huddle near heated walls, lining the cloister, but historians still argue whether those privileges eased suffering or simply concentrated contagion. Nearby, two children cough in unison, their ragged breaths misting the air. In medieval thought, cold air itself was once blamed as the fifth, humoral imbalance thought to thicken the blood and spread illness. Fringe mummers performed masked cold dances, stamping their feet and chanting incantations to scare away airborne maladies, an odd precursor to social distancing if you ask me. Scholars debate whether these rituals reduce panic more than they reduce pathogens. A hushed argument breaks out between the local barber surgeon and the village apothecary. The barber arms himself with scalpels and leech jars, claiming bloodletting alleviates fever by draining bad senses of humor. Meanwhile, the apothecary scoffs, waving a vial of frostflower elixir distilled from icicle water and angelica root. Both practitioners insist their methods offer salvation. Historians still argue which was more deadly leeching or experimental frost elixirs. You watch as the barber surgeon nods solemnly and leans over old Jutta, a polished blade gleaming in the firelight. He incises her arm and you cringe. Not because blood trickles out, but because the wound will freeze before it scabs, trapping infection inside. A mainstream fact, many medieval wounds turned gangrenous in freezing conditions, leading to amputations that doctors performed with little anesthesia beyond a swig of mead. Historians still debate the frequency of frost-related amputations versus those driven by battlefield injuries. Across the room, the apothecary drips frostflower elixir onto a bandage, then presses it gently against a cluster of sores on a young mother's arm. Fringe lore claims that icicle distilled water possesses a purity that neutralizes noxious senses of humor. But scholars dismiss this as fanciful. You can't help but wonder if the mother will prefer a quick death or weeks of this painful poultice. Suddenly, a wailing cry pierces the chamber as a gaunt villager collapses on the straw-covered floor. He is blue around the lips, likely case 0 of frostbite, complicated by sepsis. The barber surgeon considers cauterizing his frostbitten toes with a heated iron while the apothecary urges a soak in warmed butter and rosemary oil. Mainstream medical treatises mention that hot fat soaks offered some relief for frozen limbs, yet many victims reportedly cried out louder from the burning than from the cold. Historians still argue whether fat soaks save digits or simply replace frostpain with scalds. You inch closer to the larder-like shelves, spotting bottles of plague water borrowed from city apothecaries. This mixture of crushed pearls, mercury, and elderberry was reputed to halt the blackening of flesh in bubonic victims, something you pray none here require. Fringe speculators tell tales of mercury mummies, where bodies preserved in mercury for weeks kept the disease at bay. But scholars remind us that mercury is a poison that might have killed faster than the plague. You shiver wondering which poison is preferable. A young boy coughs up dark sputum into a bowl at his feet. The midwife absent-mindedly hums a lullaby as she wraps him in warmed linen swaddles. You recall that medieval dormitories often assigned a chief swaddler, someone responsible for keeping linens clean and warmed in straw-lined boxes. Historians still debate whether such warming boxes existed widely or were confined to monastic infirmaries. Through a narrow doorway, you glimpse the herb garden behind the manor. Empty now, the soil, frozen solid, it once provided fresh roots and barks in gentler seasons. Fringe herbalists scoured the forest floor for winter greens, licking snow off evergreen needles believed to impart vitamin C and stave off scurvy. Scholars argue whether medieval folk understood scurvy's cause or simply stumbled upon remedies by trial and error. As you return to the hearth, you spot a small heap of clean snow on a table. The apothecary is filtering it through a linen cloth to use as distilled water, a medieval distillation method lacking alembics. Mainstream pharmacists recorded that pure snow water helped concoct tinctures without contaminating ions. Still, you worry that melting it near the fire introduces ash and soot. Historians still argue the effectiveness of such primitive filtration versus rainwater collection. You settle on a stool, dipping a clay cup into a pot of brewing elderflower tea, one of the few warming beverages not imported from distant lands. Its floral aroma cuts through the smoky haze. You hand the cup to a shivering laborer, whose gratitude flickers like the embers in the hearth. 3 light jokes surface, you muse. That snow in your tea might be the next hip trend. You consider offering a subscription for monthly frostflower elixir shipments, and you wonder if medieval tea blocks could have helped public health. As the afternoon wanes, the infirmary's occupants drift between fever dreams and shivering consciousness. You stare at old Juta's sunken eyes, resolve swelling in your chest. Despite the smoke, the drafts, and the creeping frost people here cling to life armed with mortar blade, bitter herbs, and unwavering hope. Historians still argue which method of medieval medicine was the least deadly, but you know that in winter survival was itself the greatest cure. You rise, leaving the whispered prayers and desperate treatments behind, stepping back into the white world outside. The cold air hits you like a gauntlet, but at least you've seen how the sick fought alongside the healthy, bound by shared vulnerability. You trudge onward carrying the weight of fragile lives and the knowledge that winter's diseases were foes, both seen and unseen. You leave the infirmary behind, stepping into a world where life's most devoted companions, the animals you once depended on, now hang in the balance. The air carries a mournful bleat from the hillside, where shepherds desperately herd frost-stiffened sheep toward a meager shelter. You recall that livestock losses during peak medieval winters sometimes exceeded half a flock. stripping families of both food and warmth. Historians still argue whether transhumans' practices moving animals to lower pastures could have mitigated such losses or simply spread the misery across regions. As you trudge up the slope, you catch sight of woolly shapes huddled beneath a scraggly copse of pines. The sheep press against one another like living snowbanks, their coats matted with ice. Fringe accounts claim that some pastoralists shaved sheep's bellies and filled the exposed skin with straw, creating a makeshift wool straw sandwich to trap heat. Scholars debate whether this bizarre technique ever saw widespread adoption or remained the stuff of eccentric livestock keepers. A shepherd named Ragna spots you and beckons you over with a gloved hand. Her face is lined with worry, and she points to a group of lambs too weak to stand. Mainstream agrarian records note that lamb mortality soared during cold snaps, especially for newborns who lacked wool protection. You kneel beside the shivering creatures, recalling that medieval midwives sometimes coated newborn lambs in warm animal fat, rendering them slippery but slightly warmer. Historians still argue whether such practices offered genuine benefits or simply hastened predation by foxes. Behind Ragna, dozens of sheep lie motionless, their bodies a patchwork of frosted fleece. You stifle a gasp. The sight feels like walking through a graveyard of bleats. The shepherd gestures to a makeshift pen constructed from stacked logs and snow walls. The barrier's intent was to break the wind, but now it feels more like a snow tomb. Fringe builders once experimented with burning turf beneath pens to create radiant ground heat, but skeptics argue the smoke suffocated the animals. Scholars debate whether turf fires ever saved a single sheep, or just created the world's hottest barn. You help Ragna gather the surviving sheep, coaxing them toward the pen. Each step the animals take is labor, their hooves cracking like brittle twigs against the ice. You offer them handfuls of moldy hay, which they nibble begrudgingly, an ironic snack given the mold's potential toxicity. Mainstream fodder guides warned against feeding frost-damaged hay. Yet, in lean winters, villagers had little choice. Historians still argue if hay fumigation methods, steaming bales over hot stones, could have reduced mold or simply baked out nutrients. The frosty breath of each animal mingles with your own, forming a ghostly chorus of exhalations. You notice one sheep with a bare patch on its side wool, lost to skin disease, exacerbated by wet conditions. Fringe healers recommended rubbing the area with a mixture of pine resin and lard, hoping to seal wounds against drafts. Scholars, however, question whether such salves promoted healing or simply attracted flies come spring. Ragna leads you to her prized dairy cow, a matronly creature whose heavy udder swings like a pendulum beneath a frost-encrusted quilt. Mainstream dairy records indicate that milk yields plummeted in winter, often halving production as cows starved of forage. Historians still argue whether bringing cows indoors with supplemental fodder like boiled turnip mash was common practice, or reserved for wealthier farms. You kneel to stroke the cow's muzzle. The animal looks at you with weary eyes that seem almost human in their desperation. You quietly recall that some farmers believed speaking softly to livestock encouraged milk flow, a notion historians still debate. Was it true empathy or just a comforting myth? Regardless, you whisper soothing words and pour a bucket of warm barley gruel at her feet. The cow laps greedily, and you feel a flicker of triumph. Perhaps not all is lost. A sudden flurry of feathers catches your eye, a group of geese penned near the barn door. Their honks echo like forlorn trumpets in the crisp air. Fringe poultry keepers once thought that submerging geese bills in warm water would keep them from ingesting deadly ice crystals, though scholars point out that geese often dunk their heads in water whenever available, no tutorial needed. You offer them a handful of cracked corn, watching as they gobble it down in a frenzy. Nearby, the village pigsty stands empty. Its former occupants were slaughtered days ago. You remember the smell of pork curing in snowpacks, a luxury only the better off could afford. Mainstream references to salt-cured meats note that northern communities relied heavily on pork for winter calories, but when fodder ran out, butchering was inevitable. Historians still debate whether small-scale pig husbandry could have been sustained through cold snaps, or if seasonal slaughter was always unavoidable. You turn to survey the scene: frostbitten sheep, a milk-deprived cow, and geese, making the best of a bleak season. Even so, signs of resilience emerge: a sheep with a tuft of new wool, peeking through frost, a calf nudging its mother for warmth, and geese huddling together in synchronized harmony. Nature's instinct to endure mirrors the villagers' determination. Together with Ragna, you reinforce the snow walls around the pen and carry additional straw inside a lean-to shelter. You stack feet higher, crafting a small windbreak of hay bales. 3 light jokes spring to mind. You consider branding the pen. The coal oasis, imagine geese in medieval parkas, and muse that sheep might prefer a medieval spa day with heated stones if only such technology existed. As dusk falls, you help Ragna lead the animals back toward the barn's interior warmth. The cow trudges behind, her bell metal clank echoing in the growing silence. You pause at the threshold, pressing your cheek to the wooden frame as you listen to the creatures settle inside their breaths, sinking into a soothing rhythm. The barn's partial warmth, thanks to composting manure beneath the floor, offers a modicum of comfort, though you know mornings here remain unforgiving. Before you leave, Ragna presses a small wool-wrapped bundle into your hands, a gift of fresh cheese curds from the cow's last milking. They're cold but still soft, a rare morsel in these frozen days. You nod your thanks, tucking the bundle into your satchel with reverence. Whether those curds stave off hunger or simply symbolize hope is a matter scholars still debate. For now, they feel like the warmest treasure you found all day. You turn your back on the barn and descend the snow-laden hill, the wool-wrapped curds snug against your chest. Each step feels lighter, buoyed by the knowledge that life persists against the harshest elements. The moon rises pale and distant, casting long shadows across the glistening field. You breathe deeply, tasting hope in the frost-crisp air. As you reach the village edge, you look back at the lights glowing through barn windows, tiny lighthouses in an ocean of ice. In this world of pastoral despair, ingenuity and care have preserved a thread of life for another day. You clutch the curds, imagining their warmth midwinter, and vow to return at dawn to check on Ragna's flock. Because in medieval winters, survival was woven from compassion as much as from hearts, and together human and animal endured. You trudge toward the granary once more, your breath ghosting into frosty air as you prepare for the grim ritual of checking seed stores. Last autumn's failed harvest hangs over you like a dark omen when fields yield little more than thistle and stubble. The promise of spring planting dies before it begins. You probably won't plant anything next year. But hey, at least you've mastered the art of granular despair. Historians still argue whether medieval crop rotations or lack thereof sealed the fate of winter stores, but everyone agrees that one bad autumn could doom an entire community. Mainstream agronomists note that medieval peasants typically reserved a third of their grain harvest as seed for spring sowing. Yet when storms struck during harvest, like those infamous rains of 1315 that turned fields into quagmires, grain sprouted prematurely in the sheaves, germinating hopelessly in damp stacks. You lean against the cold stone wall of the granary and peer through its narrow doorway, rows of bins, each cradling the precious few seeds meant for next year's hope. If those seeds fail, you'll be planting thistles instead, unless historians ever agree that thistles make a decent cover crop. Fringe lore claims that some enterprising farmers hoarded acorns and chestnuts in secret vaults, planning to sprout nut trees in the future less hostile climate. Scholars debate whether medieval woodland foraging was a widespread backup strategy or simply the stuff of romantic forest myths. You run a chilling fingertip over a wooden bin labeled wheat, seed, remembering how last year's autumn hailstorm shattered kernels like tiny glass, clinking on the rock. The kerneled clatter still echoes in your nightmares. Inside the granary, a faint, musty odor rises, half a grain, half mold, reminding you that damp granaries are seed killers. Mainstream builders eventually elevated floors on stone pillars and added vents, but your village's granary sits flush on the ground, inviting moisture to creep in. You whisper a silent prayer that whatever seeds remain haven't succumbed to rot, even as historians still argue whether raised granary floors made a significant difference or merely collected rodents at eye level. You pry the lid off the first bin, revealing round barley seeds dusted with frost. They look deceptively plump, but you know appearances can lie. Tiny shoots may have begun growing inside, reducing viability. Fringe agrarians once recommended tossing grain onto frozen ponds to kill any nascent sprouts. But scholars question whether submerging seeds in ice water did more harm than good. You scoop a handful into your palm and let them slip through your fingers, the grains rattling like dice of destiny. Turning to another bin, you find only a scant handful of rye seed meant for next spring's sourdough bread. You recall that rye thrived in poorer soils and colder climates, making it a medieval staple. Historians still debate whether rye or barley was more critical to northern diets, but here both are in short supply. You rustle through the bin, unearthing a solitary rat bone. Tangled among the seeds prove that rodents turned the granary into their buffet. You flick the bone aside with a grim laugh, joking that rats probably held secret winter feasts behind your back. Beyond the bins lies a small sack marked "Reserve a Community Fund of Seed Grain," meant to be shared if any household stores failed. Mainstream village statutes often mandated such communal reserves, though enforcement varied. Historians still argue whether those reserves existed in practice, or if they were little more than guidelines scribed by absent lords. You peek inside the sack and find perhaps a dozen grains, barely enough to sow a single furrow. Panic flutters in your chest. If community seed runs out, you'll be at the mercy of nobler neighbors, or forced to beg for borrowed seed sowing debt instead of hope. You push the heavy granary door open wider, stepping onto a snow-crusted ramp. Outside, villagers await news, many clutching empty sacks, faces pinched with anxiety. You clear your throat and deliver the grim tally. Seed supplies are critical. We've got enough barley for half a field rye for a quarter and nothing else. A collective groan rises the sound, muffled by scarves and shock. Someone pipes up. Perhaps the squirrels have hidden acorns, eliciting a few nervous giggles. Only later will scholars debate whether arboreal caching provided edible nuts or just squirrel-powered nut mazes. As murmurs swell into an argument, you urge calm. Remember, you say, last season's linen-clad fashionably failed. We can't let panic drive us to waste what little we have. 3 light jokes later about trading scarves for seed, launching a crowdfunding crusade in the market square, and inventing medieval seed swap apps Tension almost breaks, but the reality remains without seed spring planting stalls, and next winter's granary groans. Mainstream manorial rolls sometimes record that lords loaned seed to peasants at interest demanding repayment with extra tithes. Historians still argue whether this system empowered fragile communities or plunged them deeper into feudal debt. A villager reminds you of a tale where a benevolent lord distributed chestnut flour as an alternative food staple. Perhaps that nut hoarding wasn't so fringe after all. You make a mental note to petition the manor for chestnuts, if only to diversify your carbohydrate portfolio. You call for volunteers to inspect other storage sites, old barns, attic chests, even hidden niches in granaries, searching for forgotten seed caches. A trio of farmers sets off pickaxes in hand, creaking through icicle doorways. You remain behind, tallying what's left. The dim light from your lantern flickers across icy bins, turning seeds into glittering promises or ghosts of better harvests. A scholar from the nearby priory strides in a scroll case, clutched under the arm. He examines the granary structure and seed quality with a scholarly frown. A raised floor on 6 pillars would have reduced dampness by nearly 20%, he muses. Yet, here we sit with half the capturable protectant. Historians still argue whether such priory innovations ever filtered into peasant villages or stayed locked within cloister walls. You nod politely while inwardly planning to replicate that design next summer, if you survive the spring. Outside, the volunteer farmers return their boots, scraping snow from the ramp. They carry a small burlap bag bulging with seeds, black beans someone forgot to sow last autumn. Fringe kitchen lore says that beans and peas stored in smoked barns last longer, but scholars debate whether smoke preservation affected seed germination. You empty the mysterious bean haul into a new bin, hoping that at least a few sprouts come planting time. You joke that this might be your village's first lentil revolution. A hush falls over the waiting villagers as you confirm their haul. It's enough to sow 3/4 of a field, provided they plant immediately after the ice thaws. Any delay, and even these survivors will rot or be eaten by mice. You deliver the news firmly. We plant on Candlemas Day, or all is lost. 3 light jokes later about holy candlelit planting ceremonies, competing sacramentals of seed blessing, and a winter version of Sputnik launch with a golden seed. You see cautious smiles flicker. You close the granary door, leaning your weight against it, as if to keep the cold and despair at bay. In this crumbling winter, the seed is hope, incarnate, fragile, and finite. Historians still argue whether communal seed reserves ever truly saved villages or merely papered over systemic vulnerabilities. Yet, in this moment, you trust that shared resolve and careful stewardship will carry you through spring's perilous thaw. You trudge back through the village, your boots crunching over crusted snow as you prepare to witness the grim ballet of siege preparations. In medieval winters when feuds flared, war froze into specters of starvation and ice rather than fiery arrows. Today, the local lord's banner flutters over the courtyard, an ominous signal that supply lines must be guarded and fortifications shored against both enemy and frost. Mainstream military records note that winter sieges often devolved into stalemates with besiegers hunkering in snow-covered camps cut off from reinforcements. Historians still argue whether investing in winter campaigns was strategically sound or simply an excuse for nobles to avoid work at home. As you pass beneath the portcullis, you feel the chill bite through the stone archway. Inside, soldiers patrol ramparts slick with ice, halting periodically to clear snow from the crenellations. Fringe, siege. Experts claimed that pouring boiling oil onto frozen walls would melt ice and burn attackers simultaneously, but scholars question whether oil storage and heating logistics ever made this tactic viable. You watch a guard heave a kettle of scalding lard more for animal fat than strategic acid and mutter about wasted resources. You ascend the spiral staircase. To the battlements, each step a treacherous slip if you're not careful. The Lord's engineer stands at the parapet, surveying the frozen moat below. This ice is our ally, he declares, but one warm day could shatter our barrier. Mainstream fortification treatises mention creating intentional freeze-thaw cycles to weaken enemy walls, though historians still debate whether medieval engineers understood thermal expansion or merely relied on folk wisdom. From the battlements, you gaze upon the enemy encampment across the plain, a dozen tents half collapsed beneath snow's weight. Sentries patrol with spears tipped in iron, their armor clogged with slush. You recall that defensive garrisons often ration salt to preserve meat and leather. Yet in winter shortages, salt sometimes became more precious than silver. Historians argue whether controlling salt mines during winter was more decisive than holding fortified passes. A trebuchet parked on the outer bailey sits idle, its sling froze stiff. Siege crews gamble on thawing temperatures to resume bombardment, but until then, the machine is a monument to halted violence. Fringe chronicles speak of teams wrapping siege engines in a cloth dipped in animal fat to prevent ice buildup, a sort of medieval tarp, though scholars debate the practicality of such an operation under enemy fire. You wander toward the keep's inner courtyard, where a half-frozen well gurgles. Water drawn from it forms icicles around the bucket's rim. Soldiers dip buckets and let them sit in the sunlit snow to melt, slowly collecting drip water for cooking. Mainstream logistical manuals advise stockpiling firewood and coal for winter, but in practice, armies often scavenge local forests, angering villagers whose own fires dimmed for lack of fuel. Historians still argue whether early rationing or pillaging strategies better sustained armies in frost. Ahead, a line of oxen hauls wagons filled with stones materials for reinforcing breached walls and filling gaps where frost cracked masonry. The animals' harnesses rattle as they struggle through knee-deep drifts. Bringe agricultural manuscripts suggested trimming oxen hooves to reduce slipping, but scholars note that too short hooves risked frostbite and injury, making the practice controversial. In a sheltered nook, you find a makeshift smithy blazing with charcoal. A blacksmith hammers iron tools into shape. His gloves removed for dexterity despite the cold that numbs his fingers. He fashions metal plates to line wooden shutters, hoping to trap heat within the keep's great hall. Mainstream craft guild records describe specialized wintersmith techniques for producing thicker ironwork, but historians still debate whether those methods spread beyond urban centers. You pause at the great hall's massive oak doors carved with heraldic beasts now frosted white. Inside, a slender ribbon of smoke curls upward from a single brazier at the center, far too small to heat the cavernous space. Three light jokes cross your mind. You imagine medieval streaming services offering keep heating subscriptions. You consider petitioning for royal decrees, mandating smaller halls for cold economies. And you joke that you'd host a bring-your-own-blanket banquet. Suddenly, the blow of a horn echoes through the courtyard locusts. Know the signal for a supply convoy's approach. You rush outside to see wagons cresting the hill, bearing barrels of salted meat and sacks of grain from a distant manor. Soldiers cheer, shoving each other to be first at the barrels. Mainstream supply chain studies reveal that timely winter convoys could tip a siege's balance, yet unpredictable weather often derailed these critical lifelines. Historians still argue whether investing in road maintenance would have saved more lives or been too costly to justify. As the wagons unload, you observe how each barrel is hastily sealed with wax and bark to keep out moisture, a rudimentary but essential measure. Fringe preservation notes recommended coating containers in beeswax, infused with resin for waterproofing, but scholars debate whether the extra labor was worth the marginal gains. You help roll a barrel toward the keep's storehouse, grateful for the reprieve from empty granaries and frozen meats. Inside the storehouse, rows of provisions glint under torchlight, salted fish hung in brine tubs, cured meats suspended overhead, and sacks of processed millet stacked neatly. You breathe in the briny aroma and feel warmth creep into your chest. Mainstream larders often featured raised flooring and sloped ceilings to direct condensation away, a design you vow to copy. Historians still argue whether rural communities ever adopted such sophisticated larder designs, or if they remained luxuries of the wealthy. You assist in distributing rations to soldiers and workers alike, watching as frozen faces break into relieved smiles. Yet you can't help but recall that this winter bounty is borrowed from distant fields and lords' coffers and must be replenished come spring. Otherwise, this reprieve becomes merely a pause in the season's relentless hunger. Stepping back outside, you glance at the moat-turned ice arena, where skirmishes might resume whenever thaw permits. The siege has become a standstill, a tableau of suspended violence frozen in time. You trudge down the snowy ramparts each step, echoing in the hush, carrying the weight of what it takes to wage war in winter's domain. Ahead lies the village, once more your true home, where survival depends less on battlements and more on hearth and neighbor. You pause at the threshold, fingers brushing stone cold to the touch, and whisper, "Winter spares no one soldier or serf alike." Then you head back to the hall, ready to share tales of the keep's siege chores and to reinforce communal resolve against the frost's siege of the soul. You slip quietly from the keep's gloom, back into the village churchyard, where icicles dangle from the eaves like crystalline tears. Inside the nave, the flicker of candlelight casts elongated shadows across stone pews, dusted with frost. Despite the drafty aisles and half-frozen flagstones, this sacred space feels warmer than any hearth-proof that faith and charity can outshine coal embers. Mainstream ecclesiastical records note that churches organized winter alms to feed the poor, distributing bread and broth on designated days. Historians still argue whether such charity was genuine compassion or a communal tax to secure social order. You join the line of huddled parishioners, clutching wooden bowls, their breath swirling in the pews, as Father Anselm raises a simple carved chalice. He murmurs a blessing over a cauldron of thin vegetable soup, mostly turnips and onion skins, and ladles it into each bowl. Fringe hagiographies report that some miraculous wells beneath churches produced warm water on frigid mornings, though scholars dismiss this as a pious legend. Yet for a moment, you swear the broth's steam carries a hint of warmth that no heart could match. As you step forward, you notice a group of well-dressed merchants pacing behind you. Their furs look plush enough to smother cold, and they whisper among themselves about donating 10 loaves for the next Sunday. Mainstream tithing records show that trade guilds often contributed food and coin to church relief funds, though historians still argue whether merchants gave altruistically or to curry favor with clerical authorities. You catch a sly grin on one merchant's face, perhaps a negotiation with St. Peter's ledger. Cradling your bowl of soup, you move to a side aisle, where wooden benches offer seating. The soup is lukewarm at best, but each spoonful feels like a sacrament. You recall that some monasteries added honeyed wine to their alms broth, a rare treat. Yet such luxuries remained confined to abbey tables. Scholars debate whether parish churches ever emulated monastic generosity or simply lacked resources. Fragments of prayer echo from the choir loft as acolytes move among flickering candelabras, their robes trailing snowy footprints. Three light jokes form in your mind. You consider pitching medieval soup kitchen as a subscription service. Imagine a viral challenge to ladle from the coldest cauldron, and muse that blessing your broth could be the season's hottest alchemical trend. But you bite back the quips out of respect. This moment demands solemn solidarity. After your meal, you leave the chapel and step into a lean-to porch, where a parish elder collects donations of blankets and straw. Villagers hang patched cloth strips on a line, each one a promise that someone's roof will hold just a little longer. Mainstream parish inventories list blankets for the poor as staples, but historians still debate whether distribution favored certain families or aimed for equitable sharing. You hang your ragged blanket among sturdier weaves, hoping your meager offering spurs someone else's generosity. Outside, the church bell tolls, a single knell signaling midday prayers, and another round of alms distribution to the infirm and elderly. You follow the procession to a small side chapel, where makeshift infirmary rows of benches draped with coarse wool hosts the frail. Friars move quietly among the sufferers, pressing a warmed vial of broth and blessing each visitor. Fringe devotional texts claim that these broth vials were anointed with consecrated oil to amplify healing, though scholars dismiss the idea as a symbolic flourish. A blind beggar named Martha sits on the threshold, her cupped hands trembling in the cold. You recall that medieval law exempted the blind and infirm from forced labor, yet they often relied entirely on alms. Historians still argue whether ecclesiastical charity improved blind people's quality of life or merely avoided broader social welfare reforms. You kneel and place your blanket over Martha's lap, then guide her into the chapel's warmth to receive her soup. Her silent gratitude feels like a prayer answered. Returning outside, you overhear tradesmen debating the next communal fundraiser plans to carve decorated wooden bowls and sell them at the market. Mainstream parish meeting minutes reference bowl and ladle fairs held before Candlemas to raise funds for winter relief. Scholars still argue whether these fairs originated in Christian rituals or evolved from older pagan festivals celebrating midwinter light. You laugh at the irony of buying votive bowls to feed the hungry, yet everyone seems keen on the effort. You wander toward the churchyard's lich gate, where a group of children, clothing too thin for this season, gather around a hot iron brazier. They roast chestnuts donated by the local miller, their laughter rising into the frosty sky. Fringe storytellers claimed that roasted chestnuts had magical warming properties, a belief that persisted in folk songs. Historians still debate whether chestnut trees were common enough in Northern Europe to support such traditions, or whether the practice was imported. A sudden hush falls as the great church door swings open. A traveling bishop clad in fur-trimmed cope enters his arrival, announced by a flutter of privilege and relief. He inspects the alms station, personally distributing small purses of coin and pronouncing indulgences on generous donors. Mainstream synodal decrees illustrate that bishops sometimes mandated special collections for famine relief, though historians still argue whether these funds reached affected villages or were diverted to cathedral rebuilding projects. You notice one purse slotting into a chest, labeled cathedral repairs, and you wonder how the poor's gift became masonry. As the bishop departs, blessing the village with perfumed incense, you reflect on the intricate dance of charity and power at play. The church, while a beacon of hope in winter's darkest hours, also wove webs of obligation and influence. Yet today, in this frost-bitten hamlet, alms saved lives offering soup blankets, and the human kindness that a hearth alone could not provide. You turn from the lich gate, your heart warmed by shared compassion. You realize that even in the dead of winter, the church's candlelight and collective generosity forge a warmth more enduring than wood or wool. Clutching your empty bowl, you make your way back toward home, ready to share with neighbors what you've learned. That in medieval winters, charity could be the fiercest fire of all. You step into the village square, where shadows lengthen as dusk falls, ready to confront the swirling broth of superstitions and folk remedies that buoy spirits through the frost. Lanterns hung from posts cast ghostly light on gatherings of villagers huddled in woolen cloaks, comparing notes on every odd ritual meant to banish cold's bite. Mainstream anthropologists record that medieval communities relied heavily on ritual to manage the unknown, especially in harsh seasons. Historians still argue whether these practices offered real psychological relief or merely distracted from suffering. At the center stands Old Brenna, the local wise woman brandishing a broomstick, topped with dried vervain and rowan berries. She warns against winter witches who ride the north wind, a fringe belief that gained traction after a particularly vicious blizzard in 1392. Scholars debate whether such tales were rooted in pagan lore or invented to explain unexplained frost damage. Brenna dips her broom into a cauldron of boiling water infused with juniper, then flicks droplets onto the crowd as a purification blizzard. You flinch as icy mist settles on your cheeks but can't help smiling at the theatrical flare. Nearby, a small group juggles handfuls of heated stones passed around in a cloth sack. The stone dance, a fringe remedy for frostbite, involved rubbing these hot rocks against the skin to stimulate circulation. Scholars still argue whether the practice risked burns or genuinely promoted warmth. You accept a stone, marveling at how its heat pulses against your palm, then hand it to a trembling neighbor, who lets out a grateful sigh. A trio of villagers recites an old rhyme. Frost on the pain bite, like bane, sing us the sunbreak cold's chain. They believe a song can coax warmth from the sky. Mainstream folklorists note that communal singing did improve morale in winter, though climate experts argue the actual temperature remained unaffected. Yet you hum along, feeling your heart lighten with each note even as the wind shrugs at the melody. Under a thatched tarp, someone boils a brew of nettle tea with a pinch of ground ginger, the latter a scarce imported spice. Fringe healers claimed ginger's inner fire countered cold's damp weight, and some monastic gardens prized it as a winter cure. Scholars debate whether such spiced teas were ritual or genuine medicine, but the spicy aroma cuts through the chill, warming your nostrils. At the edge of the square, a circle of children stomps in unison around a carved wooden wheel painted with symbols of the sun and moon. The turning wheel ritual symbolizes ushering in returning daylight. Mainstream ritual studies link such practices to ancient solstice festivals, yet historians still argue whether medieval villagers consciously preserved these pagan roots or simply reinvented them. You approach a bonfire fueled by driftwood, scavenged from frozen riverbanks. Villagers toss small offerings, dried herbs, carved talismans into the flames, praying for a mild spring. Three light jokes cross your mind. You consider marketing blizzard burning as a new winter sport. Imagine a snowburn festival sponsored by Spice Trader and muse that this could be the world's original lantern festival. As sparks dance upward, you realize these rituals weave a tapestry of a shared belief that no hearth or granary could supply. Even skeptics join in the chants if only to feel part of something larger than their frozen plight. In medieval winters, superstition and solidarity kindled a fire in the soul brighter than any brazier. You turn to leave the square, the bonfire's glow fading behind you like a dying ember. In its flickering warmth, you carry the lesson that sometimes the strongest protection against cold lies not in wool or wood, but in collective hope. Sparked by ritual song and a dash of ginger, you pause at the bonfire's edge, clinging to the smoke-warm air. As you catch the scent of lavender sprigs tied to the firewood, a fringe, custom, believed to encourage dreams of spring. Scholars debate whether aromatic flowers in winter rituals truly influence the mind or simply sweeten the bitter air. Nearby, someone dips a sprig into honey, then applies it behind their ears, an improvised ear balm thought to ward off frost rime. You try it, feeling the sticky sweetness against your skin and finding surprising comfort in its simple stickiness. Across the square, an elderly man rattles a hollow bone filled with pebbles and sings a wry tune to shake off the frost, performing what folklorists classify as a weather dance. Historians still argue whether such noisy displays had any effect on actual weather patterns or served chiefly to rally spirits. You tap your foot in time, realizing that movement, laughter, and rhythm offer warmth more reliable than any wool cloak. Turning a corner, you encounter a small fire pit ringed by stones. Villagers roast chestnuts and small loaves of unsalted bread cake, pressing them against their chests to share body heat. An impromptu warmth-sharing circle. Fringe bakers once experimented with embedding hot coals inside specially hollowed loaves, dubbing them bread radiators. But scholars question both their safety and culinary merit. You accept a roasted chestnut and feel its gentle heat slide down your throat, a tangible spoonful of hope. As the moon rises high, the bonfire dwindles into glowing embers. A hush falls and old Brenna steps forward again, raising her arms to the sky as though coaxing a tangible sunbeam from the stars themselves. She leads a soft chant that drifts into the night. Cold be gone, warmth return. Dawn's bright grace our spirits burn. The circle joins in the melody weaving through the frost-bitten air. Even skeptics feel their hearts flutter with anticipation, a collective incantation of optimism against winter's oppression. You close your eyes, letting the communal warmth of song seep into your bones. The cold remains, but your spirit feels a soft ember glow within. You open your eyes to see villagers exchanging wry smiles, their breath still misting, but their postures relaxed if only slightly. Here, around these modest flames and simple rituals, you glimpse a resilience that no siege or famine could extinguish. With one last look at the embers, you step away from the bonfire and the circle of hopeful souls. The chill returns, but within you burns a small, steadfast flame, fed by shared belief and ingenuity. In medieval winters, it wasn't just food, fire, or fabric that saved lives. It was the rituals, the camaraderie, the pounding of stones in rhythmic dance, and the ginger spice mugs passed from hand to hand. You slip from the square, your footsteps guided by the memory of laughter chants and the bonfire's red glow. The frost may cling to every surface, but in your heart, you carry the warm ember of collective hope. A reminder that even the cruelest winter can be weathered when communities kindle the fire of their shared humanity. You leave the square's flickering embers behind and make your way toward the market cross, where empty stalls and shuttered shops stand as silent witnesses to hardship. Medieval economies were fragile beasts in winter trade, slow to a trickle. Coins vanished from pockets and markets became scenes of desperate bargaining, rather than bustling commerce. Mainstream economic records show that prices for staple goods could double or worse when supply routes froze over. Historians still argue whether centralized royal granaries might have stabilized markets or only shifted burdens onto struggling villages. As you approach, you hear raised voices drifting from the half-floodlit plaza. A crowd has gathered around a barrel-turned pulpit, where a stout townsman berates the town council for hoarding grain. He pounds his fist on the wood fists, coated in snow, declaring, "We starve while they count their silver." Fringe pamphleteers circulated warnings of an impending winter revolt, filled with lurid tales of peasants storming manor houses. Scholars debate whether these pamphlets ever reached rural hamlets or were confined to scribe-filled city centers. You push through the throng to see the accused. The reeve, a lean man in fine wool desperately defending himself. He gestures at a ledger-board-like pages listing pounds of grain in storage. "This is for next year's sowing," he insists, voice quavering like a bell at dawn. Without it all perish, but the crowd jeers, chanting for immediate distribution. You remember reading that some village statutes required the immediate release of a portion of stored grain when food grew scarce, yet enforcement often depended on local power dynamics. Historians still argue whether such statutes ever had teeth or were mere parchment promises. From your vantage point, you spot a young woman bareheaded and clutching a ragged shawl, slinking away with a small sack of grain hidden under her coat. Hunger makes thieves of the desperate. Mainstream criminal rolls reveal that winter larceny spiked dramatically with punishments ranging from fines to flogging. Yet many offenses went unpunished to avoid emptying prisons. Scholars debate whether leniency in winter theft laws was pragmatic mercy or tacit acknowledgement of systemic failure. Nearby, a traveling merchant's cart creaks into view. He offers barley at inflated prices, his goods marked up by every mile the caravans traveled through the cold. A villager spits at the sight, accusing him of profiteering on their bones. Fringe moralists circulated tracts condemning winter usury, comparing grain speculators to vultures. Historians still argue whether medieval trade guilds effectively curbed price gouging or collaborated in keeping prices high to protect merchants' interests. You overhear two mothers haggling over the price of dried peas. One holds out a chipped spoon as payment. The other refuses, grumbling that she needs peas to feed her brood. The air hangs heavy with tension. Is it right to defend one's family at another's expense? You recall that some monasteries loaned seed peas and beans, interest-free, insisting on repayment after harvest. Yet historians still debate if these ecclesiastical loans truly alleviated hunger or plunged borrowers into spiritual and material debt. A sudden shout breaks out as a small group of youths overturn a market stall, sending a cascade of frozen eggs rolling across the cobbles. The townsmen cheer and you cringe, imagining the slapstick mess, but recognizing the anger fueling such acts. Fringe urban chronicles dramatized these moments as the sparks that ignited larger uprisings, yet scholars caution that most spring riots dissipated as quickly as they flared. When the hope of thaw arrived, you step forward and call for calm, reminding the crowd that violence could bring harsh reprisals from the manor's constables. Three light jokes emerge about medieval riot insurance, volunteer riot guard subscriptions, and crowdfunding for a pie-dropping protest stunt. Yet you temper them knowing the stakes are real. The crowd's fervor flickers, some shifting uneasily, as guards bearing halberds appear on the fringe. The reeve seizes the moment, promising an extra measure of grain at dawn if peace holds. He orders several strong men to escort the merchant's cart to the communal granary, where all can purchase at regulated rates. A rumble of approval runs through the masses. Mainstream records indicate that such regulated markets occasionally emerge during crises, though historians still argue whether they represented genuine restraint or desperate political theater. As the crowd disperses, you notice a knot of elderly men lingering around a makeshift notice board. They pore over parchments announcing a temporary tax relief, another reprieve from the Lord's treasury. But a scholar of manorial law might point out that such reliefs were often symbolic, reinstated once coin flowed again. Historians still debate whether these proclamations truly eased villagers' burdens or merely bought social peace. You watch the last of the market carts roll away and the stalls close down. The stalls' shutters clang shut, echoing through the hush as torches flicker and gutter into darkness. In this economic crucible, stability proved fleeting. A barrel of grain can calm a crowd, but only for a moment. You recall that spring's promise of sowing must follow swiftly, or the memory of today's grain sharing becomes a bitter reminder of unfulfilled pledges. As you turn to leave, a merchant's apprentice approaches, offering you a brass token stamped with the reef's seal, a promise of a discounted ration tomorrow. You tuck the token into your vest pocket like a talisman of precarious hope. Whether that token redeems real sustenance or merely placates uncertainty, scholars still argue. For you, it symbolizes that in medieval winters, economic collapse and social unrest threatened to freeze more than bodies they could crack the bonds that held communities together. You trudge back toward your hall, feeling the weight of that brass token in your pocket and the memory of chanting crowds in your ears. Winter's cold may bind market and manor alike, but today's uneasy accord reminds you that solidarity, however fragile, can thaw even the hardest resentments, if only for a night. You trudge toward the edge of the frozen wood where evening's deepening blue shadows dance across brittle branches. Here, ingenious adaptation shine brightest amid the bleakness, human creativity, warming hearts when hearts falter. Mainstream builders began experimenting with ice houses, subterranean pits insulated with straw, to store perishable food through thawing seasons. Historians still argue whether common villages ever built such structures, or if they remained elite novelties around manor estates. Peering into a half-buried pit lined with thick reeds, you see the glint of frozen dairy, cheese, rounds, and butter blocks kept firm through the thaw. A fringe anecdote tells of farmers wrapping icehouse produce in animal skins soaked in brine to stave off freezer burn. Scholars debate whether salt or insulation granted greater longevity. You scrape a sliver of cheese, sharp and cold on your tongue, marveling at how frost, once foe, becomes ally in preservation. Nearby, a cluster of villagers hammers together heated bricks, sun-baked clay blocks, warmed by embers and wrapped in cloth. They place the bricks under sleeping platforms to radiate warmth through the night. Mainstream hearth guides later recommended these bed warmers, but historians still argue whether medieval people recognized thermal mass principles or simply followed folk experimentation. A blacksmith's apprentice demonstrates portable iron stoves, small box-like chambers into which embers are tucked then sealed to trap heat. Fringe inventors claim these traveling furnaces accompanied merchants on winter roads, preventing frozen cargo. Scholars debate their prevalence, citing scarce archaeological evidence. You stand close, feeling the stove's sides glow faintly, and joke that medieval campers surely had better glamping gear than you do. Continuing, you encounter a line of wooden snow fences, low barriers of split rails meant to capture drifting snow and protect pathways. Mainstream rural surveys note that such fences reduced drift accumulation by up to half, easing travel. Historians still argue whether these labor-intensive installations were common or reserved for strategic routes near market towns. You pause at a wool-insulated root cellar, dug into a hillside. Inside, turnips, carrots, and parsnips lie nestled in sand, their crisp flesh preserved despite the cold above. French horticulturists once recommended mixing straw with ash for extra drainage, though scholars debate whether ash improved shelf life or merely added mess. You bite a raw parsnip, peppery and crunchy, wondering why root cellars took centuries to reach urban kitchens. At the clearing's far side, a group constructs reed mats coated in animal fat, planning to roll them over doorways at dusk. The fat seals gaps, creating a makeshift vapor barrier against drafts. Mainstream domestic manuals later described this as a proto-weather strip, yet historians still argue whether people recognized the physics or just followed tradition. You help tug a mat into place, feeling the immediate change as cold winds soften into gentle breezes. A wandering tinkerer displays heat-reflective shields, polished metal panels positioned behind hearths to radiate heat back into the room. Fringe smiths claim these mirror walls doubled a fire's effectiveness, but scholars note that metal scarcity likely limited their use to wealthier homes. You hold one such panel, its surface shimmering in torchlight, and joke that medieval MRIs could have scanned for warmth. Further on, you find a communal project, a covered walkway of branches woven overhead and coated in pitch, linking the granary to the hall. It shields travelers from falling snow and traps body heat like a low tunnel. Mainstream municipal records from larger towns mention similar arcades for market streets. Historians still debate whether rural settlements ever adopted them, or if these notes refer only to wealthy urban centers. As dusk deepens, villagers gather around a manifold brazier, a central iron drum perforated with holes designed to burn small twigs and charcoal efficiently. The brazier's convection draws air through its base, creating a steady flame that warms a wider radius. French metallurgists argued this improved fuel economy, yet scholars remain divided on its actual impact. You load the brazier with slender sticks, watching sparks spiral upward in a tiny temporary sun. 3 light jokes cross your mind about pitching medieval heating patents to the crown, inventing a warmth subscription, or starting a hot air balloon service for frostbitten toes, but you bite back laughter, mindful that these innovations meant survival, not luxury. You step back, surveying the scene. Ice houses burrowed safely in the earth, stoves humming quietly, root cellars teeming with earthy treasures, and fences guiding wind rather than blocking it. In this landscape of resilience, people transform cold cruelty into opportunities for ingenuity and community cooperation. As you return to the hall, your boots crunching softly on the packed path, you carry a renewed sense of admiration for those who faced relentless frost and built solutions equal to the challenge. You cross the threshold and feel the hall's warmth envelop you more profound, now knowing it stems from collective adaptation rather than mere fire alone. You settle onto your straw mattress, the embers still glowing faintly in the hearth, and whisper a quiet thanks for human ingenuity that turns winter's harshest trials into triumphs of survival. You step into the dawn-lit courtyard and pause, blinking as your eyes adjust to a light less gray than you've grown accustomed to. The horizon seems sharper, the air a fraction less biting, signs that the world may be shifting beyond the relentless grip of winter. You probably won't celebrate spring just yet, but humanity's first whispers of warmer futures are stirring under the frost. Mainstream chronicles note that by the late medieval period, innovations like insulated window shutters, wooden panels lined with oiled parchment began appearing in wealthier homes, offering the promise of brighter interiors when the sun finally returned. Historians still argue whether such shutters spread quickly enough to make a meaningful difference for common folk or remained luxuries of manor estates. Ahead, you glimpse a small team of villagers lifting stone markers around new foundation trenches, early experiments in building earth-sheltered homes that rely on the insulating power of soil and snow. Fringe architects claimed these semi-subterranean dwellings felt like living inside a warm womb, though skeptics argue they risk dampness more than dryness. You slip a hand against the rough stone and feel the cool warmth radiating from where the earth holds heat beneath the frozen surface. Three light quips drift through your mind. You imagine future real estate ads boasting, "Cozy by design joke that you'd pay in grain for a subterranean Airbnb," and muse about adding heated marble floors powered by compost. Beyond the building site, a group of farmers gather around a prototype seed drill, a wooden contraption meant to plant multiple seeds in neat rows rather than scattering them by hand. Mainstream agricultural treatises from the 15th century describe similar drills, which increased germination rates by placing seeds at consistent depth. Historians still argue whether medieval villagers embraced these drills widely or dismissed them as too laborious to warrant the learning curve. You trace a finger along the drill's furrow maker, marveling at how a simple idea can promise a future where fields sprout quicker and survive the next frost. You wander toward the workshop of a local bowyer, where freshly curved yew wood beams hang to dry. The bowyer explains that by seasoning yew in wind-protected sheds, he hopes to produce stronger timbers for both longbows and roof beams, structures that will stand firmer against winter's weight. Fringe craftsmen once soaked beams in warm lye baths to pre-shrink the wood, though scholars debate whether the process weakened or strengthened the fibers. You knock on a beam and note its solid ring, a testament to human ingenuity, seeking to outthink nature's icy arms. Nearby, an experimental tiled stove glows with coals inside a clay and ceramic structure, its design inspired by distant Germanic traditions. Mainstream specialists document that such stoves could radiate heat for hours after the fire died, unlike open hearths that surrendered warmth up the chimney. Historians still argue whether such stoves spread beyond royal palaces and monasteries, or remained confined to regions rich in clay and labor. You crouch beside the stove, feeling the gentle heat seep into your frozen fingers, and wonder at the day when every home boasts such comforting warmth. A narrow lane leads you to a communal tree nursery, lined with saplings grafted onto hardy rootstock. Here, villagers trial fruit trees bred for cold tolerance, early experiments in selective cultivation, aimed at harvesting the sun's bounty even after brutal winters. Fringe horticulturists whispered of grafting apple scions onto wild hawthorn to produce winter-proof orchards, though scholars debate whether any grafted trees survived the first frost. You examine a delicate bud swelling on a graft union and imagine the day when blossoms herald spring rather than snow. 3 steps later, you come upon a modest greenhouse frame, draped in animal bladder sheets, an echo of bladder barrier insulation. repurposed for cultivating early greens. Mainstream monastic gardens later refined this into glass-pane structures. But here, ingenuity presses on with whatever materials are at hand. Historians still argue whether bladder sheet greenhouses genuinely extended growing seasons or simply gave hopeful gardeners false confidence. You slip inside the frame and breathe the slightly warmer air as if stepping into tomorrow's promise. Across the square, the smith's hammer rings against glowing iron, shaping the final pieces of a heat-reflective chimney hood designed to capture rising warmth and redistribute it into the room. Mainstream mason manuals eventually detailed elaborate flues and smoke chambers, yet these early hood prototypes hint at a future when chimneys will be both functional and efficient. Scholars still argue whether the mechanics of smoke management were understood well before the Renaissance or rediscovered anew. You tilt your head to watch smoke swirl and exit through the smokestack's curved hood, a small triumph over winter's smoky gloom. You pause before the hall's new raised sleeping platforms built, with layered timber and straw insulation beneath thin mattresses. Mainstream carpentry guides later recommend similar lofted beds to trap heat rising from floor fires. Historians still argue whether peasants ever adopted elevated sleeping arrangements or stuck to ground-level benches out of habit. You tiptoe onto the platform and sink into the straw, imagining your body cocooned in warmth awakened by centuries of trial and error. Stepping back into the main hall, you notice the reflective surfaces of newly installed beeswax candles crafted with thicker wicks and purer wax designed to burn longer and brighter, illuminating dark winter nights. Mainstream candle makers' guild records lauded improved wax filtration techniques, though historians question whether upgrades reached remote villages quickly. You lift a taper, watching it burn with a steady flame, and think about the comfort of light when darkness once ruled unchallenged. As you make your way to the hearth, you see a small woodblock calendar, marking the days until Candlemas and the first planting. It's a simple but revolutionary tool reminding villagers when to resume outdoor tasks. Rather than leaving timing to guesswork, mainstream monastery records mention elaborate liturgical calendars, but here a humble block suffices to guide the turning of seasons. Historians still argue whether medieval laypeople embraced such chronological aids or relied on natural signs alone. You turn the carved block to the next date, feeling a spark of agency in the ordered progression of time. Finally, you settle onto your straw mattress, the hearth's embers glowing gently at your feet. The hall feels different now, warmer, brighter, and brimming with the first fruits of human invention that promise to banish future winter's harshest edges. You wrap a last piece of bread in cloth, tuck it beneath your arm, and close your eyes momentarily to savor the assurance rising in your chest. From seed drills to tiled stoves, from grafted orchards to reflective chimneys, the lineage of innovations marches steadily toward gentler seasons. You lie back on the raised platform, every limb finally loosening after a day of frost-bound endurance. Outside, the wind murmurs its final complaints, but inside the hall feels softly alive. Breathe in the warm scent of beeswax and embers, and let it settle like a gentle promise in your chest. Remember that winter's bite is only a season, not a sentence. Each hardship has spurred a new invention, a fresh solution to tilt the balance toward comfort. As your breathing deepens, envision the small green shoots pushing through thawing soil, the early crocus petals unfurling shyly beneath the warming sun. Imagine fields sown with precision by wooden drills, roofs reinforced with seasoned timber, and walls kissed by ceramic stove warmth. Picture yourself wrapped in layered blankets, your toes, cushioned on raised platforms, and soft candlelight, painting the hall in a golden glow. These aren't distant dreams, but whispers carried on the windproof that creativity and community will always outlast the cold. Let each exhale carry away the memory of cold rivers, icy winds, and frozen granaries. Each inhale draws in the warmth of solidarity of shared knowledge, passed from neighbor to neighbor under crackling fires. Trust that tomorrow's dawn brings not only lighter skies but gentler days, built on the ingenuity you've witnessed. Rest now, your heartbeat a rhythm attuned to hope rather than fear. Sleep brings its warmth a quiet drift toward dreams of fertile fields and open windows. And as you drift between waking and slumber, hear the faint chorus of generations who embraced winter's challenges and crafted brighter futures. Their whispered feats of cleverness and compassion form a soft lullaby carrying you into calm rest. In the hush of your last conscious thought, remind yourself, no matter how dark or cold, the night morning's glow always follows. Close your eyes, sink deeper into warmth, and let gentle dreams cradle you until the next sunrise.